Bolo Yeung kept quiet for 35 years after Bruce Lee died, and when he finally decided to speak, the world expected him to confirm what everyone had already been whispering. Poison, a secret attack, something deliberate and concealed by powerful people. But what came out of his mouth was quieter than that, and somehow far more devastating than any conspiracy theory ever could have been. He didn't point fingers at shadowy figures or hidden enemies. He talked about destruction of a different kind, the kind that doesn't show up in court documents or official inquest reports, the kind that lingers in the people who survive you. And once you hear it, the entire story of Bruce Lee shifts in a way that the films and the documentaries and the tribute reels never quite manage. Bruce Lee wasn't just a martial artist who happened to make films. He was the person who walked into Hollywood and refused to disappear into the background the way every Asian actor before him had been expected to. The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, and then Enter the Dragon, each one pushing harder than the last, each one carrying the full force of a man who had decided that the world would take him seriously or he would destroy himself trying. That's the part that gets lost in the celebration of his legacy. He did die trying. On July 20th, 1973, at 32 years old, in an apartment in Hong Kong that belonged to an actress named Betty Ting Pei, his body finally gave out. Not from a secret attack, not from poison. The official cause was cerebral edema, a sudden swelling of the brain connected to a painkiller Betty had given him for his headaches, the same headaches he had been brushing off for weeks. Bolo Yeung, born Yang Si, came up through bodybuilding and traditional martial arts long before a film set ever came looking for him. By the time he stepped onto the set of Enter the Dragon, he'd already built a reputation as a martial arts champion with a physical presence that very few people in the industry could match. Bruce personally wanted him there, and not just for the intimidation factor. He saw in Bolo something specific, a man who genuinely understood the discipline behind every movement, someone who had earned his body through years of work rather than performance. Their training sessions went places no camera ever captured. Bolo later recalled that Bruce's speed was unlike anything he'd encountered before. But speed wasn't what stayed with him across the decades. What stayed was the relentless work ethic, the way Bruce kept going past the point where any reasonable person would have stopped, refining and drilling not for the audience watching, but for some internal standard that never seemed satisfied. The two of them sparred, challenged each other, and built something that went well beyond professional respect. Bruce had cast Bolo as the imposing villain the film needed, and though their fight scene was cut from the final version, what developed between them off-screen shaped how Bolo understood Bruce for the rest of his life. Part of that understanding was watching Bruce carry a weight the cameras never picked up on. The fame had become enormous by then. The expectations from studios, from audiences, from the Asian community watching him fight for representation were all pressing down at once. And Bruce, instead of stepping back from any of it, drove harder into all of it simultaneously. Linda Lee Caldwell had been his student first at his martial arts school in Seattle, where they met when she came to train. By 1964, they were married, and together they had 2 children, Brandon and Shannon. From the outside, the picture looked exactly right. Critically recognized films, a growing family, a mission that was visibly working, but something inside that picture had started to come apart. Bruce's obsession with perfection consumed his hours and his presence in equal measure. Late nights spent writing, researching, refining techniques that were already beyond what most fighters could execute. His weight dropped noticeably. The headaches began arriving regularly. Linda watched it all unfold, and her watching didn't slow him down by a single step. Then there was Betty. Betty Ting Pei was already an established actress in Hong Kong's film industry when her path crossed deeply with Bruce's, and she wasn't drawn in by the fame the way most outsiders were. She had built her own career and her own standing in the industry independently. But something about Bruce's energy pulled her in, and over time his visits to her apartment became something different from anything else in his life. A space where he wasn't expected to perform, where the pressure that followed him everywhere else could drop for a few hours. Some people who knew them insisted it was friendship. Others sensed it went considerably further. What nobody disputes is that Betty mattered to him, that she was one of the only people around whom Bruce actually allowed himself to slow down. On July 20th, 1973, Bruce had meetings scheduled, including final dubbing work for Enter the Dragon. He had also been consumed with developing Game of Death, which had become its own separate obsession. That morning, after meeting with producer Raymond Chow, he went to Betty's apartment. The headache was bad enough that day that he mentioned it to her directly. She gave him a painkiller and he lay down to rest. Hours passed. When Betty checked on him, he hadn't woken up. He never did. The official cause, cerebral edema triggered by a reaction to the medication, was announced, and the world stopped making sense for a while. The conspiracy theories arrived fast and loud: poisoning, calculated assassinations, ancient curses tied to the martial arts world, and old rivalries. They spread because the clean, clinical truth felt inadequate for someone like Bruce Lee. Bolo Yeung never engaged with any of it. He sat with his own understanding of what happened, one that was harder to argue with because it required no villains. Bruce had been running past empty for longer than anyone around him was willing to acknowledge. The fatigue, the headaches, the visible weight loss, none of these were mysteries. They were warnings, and he never slowed down enough to take a single one of them seriously. Betty became the story after he died, and not in any way that served her. The media fastened her name to his death as though being present at a tragedy made her responsible for it. She was the woman who was there, and that became her identity in the press, written over everything she had built in the film industry through her own work. Her account never changed. Bruce came to her apartment, he had a headache, she gave him something for the pain, he fell asleep and didn't wake up. It was a simple and painful truth, and it was never dramatic enough for the people who wanted something darker underneath it. Bolo's silence stretched across decades. And when he finally ended it, what he offered wasn't a hidden bombshell about conspiracy or cover-up. It was something harder to dismiss. He talked about the way Bruce had drawn Betty into the chaos of his private life, had allowed her to absorb pieces of his pressure and his struggle, and then left her holding all of it alone when he died. The real tragedy, in Bolo's telling, wasn't just the death itself. It was the lasting emotional damage to the people who had genuinely cared for him. Betty never stepped fully out of that shadow. The martial arts world moved on to celebrate Bruce's physical legacy and very rarely stopped to account for what that cost the people standing closest to him. Bruce Lee's story gets told as a triumph, and in important ways, it was one. He reshaped how martial arts was understood by audiences across the world. He forced Hollywood to deal with Asian actors as leads rather than background figures. He built a philosophy that outlasted every film he made and every opponent he ever faced on screen. But Bolo Yeung, the man who trained alongside him and watched him push through every physical and mental limit he encountered, walked away from the whole thing thinking about something quieter than all of that. Not the speed or the precision or the legacy that filled arenas and sold millions of tickets. About a woman sitting alone in an apartment in Hong Kong, left with the silence after the man she cared for never woke up, and about how the most disciplined fighter in any room can still lose the battles that nobody ever gets to see him fighting. Audiences across the world. He forced Hollywood to deal with Asian actors as leads rather than background figures. He built a philosophy that outlasted every film he made and every opponent he ever faced on screen. But Bolo Yeung, the man who trained alongside him and watched him push through every physical and mental limit he encountered, walked away from the whole thing thinking about something quieter than all of that. Not the speed or the precision or the legacy that filled arenas and sold millions of tickets. About a woman sitting alone in an apartment in Hong Kong, left with the silence after the man she cared for never woke up, and about how the most disciplined fighter in any room can still lose the battles that nobody ever gets to see him fighting.